So my question is for Dr. Lucyshyn, who just happened to serve on my external committee for my PhD, which was on peer-implemented PRT, which we heard about yesterday. And the question that you most stumped me on when asking me about this work was around the characteristics that I brought to the project that you thought made it successful. And specifically, it was humility. And I could not get that answer. And I've been thinking about this construct of humility and cultural humility. And I'm wondering what your thoughts on how to teach the concept of cultural humility and how to teach it to educators and to behavior analysts and lots of different staff members.
It's important to know, whenever talking about the topic of humility, that Benjamin Franklin, a few hundred years ago, said, one should never, ever talk about being humble, right? Because the moment you do, you're not humble. And so it's territory that one must enter very carefully. Because you don't want to engage in the irony of not being humble. I think one of the first things we have to do to truly become truly humble in our practice is maybe discard some of our Western cultural views on what humility is. I'm from the United States, and sometimes, I'm now a Canadian citizen, I'm happy to say, but I'm still an American, and one of the things that I've learned in my country is if you act too humble, people might think you're weak. And they might see opportunity to take advantage of you. That humility is not in my native land necessarily considered a strength. But in fact, in other cultures, it's considered the foundational strength. It's a tremendously strong approach to the world because it means you're open and flexible and responsive and not rigid and closed and dismissive. And in our work, being open and reflective and responsive and ready to notice the interaction between us and others and what we've done that's good or what we've done that's caused a certain amount of harm is really important for us moving forward and being competent and effective. And so the first thing I think we have to do is disabuse our Western, or at least North American, and I might say American notion, if I may, that humility is somehow something we should avoid, that it'll make us seem less strong, less able, less competent. In fact, I was trained by families of the many mentors I've had, a mother of a child with learning disabilities who was getting her PhD in counseling psychology, told me that the most powerful thing you can say to a parent when you start this work, when you begin this work with this challenging child who is perplexing everyone until we do the assessments and learn about them, is, I don't know. But I have a process that we can follow and we can find out together how to support this child. That's very empowering to the parent to say, I don't know. It seems to most people almost paradoxical. But in fact, what she informed me is that really helps open the relationship and helps people moving toward change. So I would say that's the main thing. Just be willing to take the risk, to have, interestingly, the irony or the paradox of having the courage to be humble. Because once you do, and you do that authentically, it opens the world of all kinds of possibilities and all kinds of learning. But my last point is this. You enter the world of humility at your own risk, because you are now forced to learn and change and see yourself through another person's eyes. And sometimes that'll be incredibly uplifting, and sometimes it'll be disappointing for you in terms of your self-image, your self-reflection. But that's the risk, and that's the power of humility. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Back to the tea thing. Just a note that if you are a behavior analyst and are concerned about the tea thing, and in particular if you were at BCABA a couple of years ago when the tea thing came up, and you're a member of BCABA, a BC Association for Behavior Analyst, you can go to the member section of the website, and on the member section of the website you will find a a statement by John Bailey, who is probably the best known behavior analyst / ethics person. That was the result of an email exchange that a few of us had after the meeting a few years ago. And he gave us permission to share the results of that email exchange with BCABA members. And in the email, if it's still on the BCABA website in the member section, which I think it is, you will see that he conceded that drinking the tea, if it's for the reasons of cultural respect and sensitivity, was perfectly okay.
Yay.
So if you don't believe Joe, you can go there and read the punchline of the tea conversation, right? The irony of the tea conversation, I mean, one of the things that was interesting in that exchange, talk about cultural kind of lenses, right? I'm like Joe, I'm a dual citizen. I'm a Canadian now, but born and raised in the United States. So I know something about U.S. culture compared to Canadian culture. And one of the things about U.S. culture, one of the things that you learn is that when people give you things, it's because they want something from you. This is a very American value. No, seriously.
It's true.
When people give you things, it's because the phrase is, if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. Right? If you give them an inch, you'll take a mile. So it's very American to think if somebody gives you something, for example, tea or dates, it's because they're going to expect something back. Right? It's not Canadian to think that. It's American to think that. So the fact that this is an American cultural value that is reflected sometimes in conversations about whether or not to drink tea is not surprising because, right, the people who say that are Americans, not Canadians. Anyway, if you're a member of BCABA, go to the member section. It should still be there. The punchline of the email exchange around the tea in case you're still uncomfortable and in case you need someone other than Joe to endorse the drinking of the tea. Thank you.
That was lovely. Thank you.
Hi. I was just wondering if you guys had any research or what your thoughts are on professionals like, for example, a behavior analyst who works with a family that they speak the language of or are from the same cultural background, the treatment efficacy or say if you're doing parent coaching, like the fidelity of the treatment implementation versus someone who doesn't speak the language or they need interpretation.
You've asked, the question is there research on, is it more effective if you speak the same language as the person who has a certain different language at home, right?
Yeah, basically.
And would that lead to more effectiveness? Now, I do parent training, so I'm going to interpret that as if I teach the parent in English, ano nihongo de hanasemasu kedo, ano nihongo wa dame desu, honto wa. I just said I can speak Japanese, but I don't do it very well. And Mariko saw that right away. She saw that I didn't do it very well.
polite.
She's going to be very nice. She'll give me nothing but hone about my Japanese. Very good job.
Maintenance of harmony.
So I don't think there's been I don't believe there's been research on if I for example teach a Japanese mom or dad in Japanese to implement PBS strategies, will they do better? Will they show greater implementation fidelity than if I did it in English, right? And then they did the work with their child with disability. There's a study, folks. But I can answer the question because I've actually had this experience. I can speak informally about my experience with that very issue. I was working with a Japanese family, and I was working with the mother and the father, and the mother's English is perfect. She is quite fluent in English. And so I would work with her in English. But the father's English was not well developed. He worked in a sushi shop. He was very much in a Japanese culture. He only spoke Japanese because everywhere he went, he was in a Japanese environment. And so I did all my training in Japanese. I started in English and I realized this isn't going to work. And so in my poor, broken Japanese, I did my best to teach him in Japanese. And And that made all the difference. Because here's why. I figured it out. This is what I do when I drive home. What was going on there? I'm thinking about this. And this is just logical. If you're always thinking and acting in one language, right, like Japanese, for example, and you get all your information in English, even if you understand it, right, or if you understand most of it, but then you enter into a Japanese speaking and thinking environment, will you remember what was said? Because what you've got to do in your head is you've got to translate the English into the language that you're actually using when you think and talk. So the moment I went into Japanese, the father was getting it like this, really quickly understanding the strategies and using with great fidelity and changing the child's behavior quickly and durably, to the point where in follow-up he told me he now helps me in the grocery store. He puts things in the basket, he stays with me, he's wonderful because the father has grasped this knowledge in his own native language.